Infrastructure Committee. We'll move now to our next item in this morning's meeting, which is a technical briefing from the Confederation of Passenger Transport on the finding of its recent report. I had the pleasure of being involved in its launch in the Norwegian Church in the Bay, and the title of the report is Bus and Coach, the Route to Net Zero in Wales. As I said, it was published last month and is very pertinent to the committee's recent work on public transport here in Wales. I wish to extend a very warm welcome to Graham Vidler, the Chief Executive of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, and Graham's going to give us a presentation first of all, and then there'll be an opportunity for members to ask questions. I'm sure there are a number of issues that we'd like to cover, so I'll transfer to you for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak with the committee this morning. It's much appreciated. So I'm going to talk briefly about some work we commissioned from WPI Economics last year, and which was launched, as you very kindly participated in last month. And our work was really started by the CCC's sixth carbon budget, with its target of obviously net zero by 2050, but also a 78% reduction in emissions by 2037. And in particular, the references in the report around that budget to the need for, in order to stay on what they call the balanced pathway, for a reduction in car miles of about 9% by 2035 and about 17% by 2050. Those car miles, the authors of the report said, would go to various other places. Some of them would be car sharing, some of them would be walking and cycling, many of them would be public transport. And the question that we asked WPI Economics to explore for us are, what are the consequences for bus and coach? Unfortunately, the paucity of data and research on the coach sector means that their findings were very much focused on the bus sector, but everything I'm going to say applies equally, I think, to the opportunities for coach travel. So the first report that WPI produced for us, and which was published in July of last year, really concluded three things: that moving journeys from car to bus and coach was necessary, desirable and possible. The fact that it's necessary really flows directly from the CCC's research, and I think there are a number of elements to that. One is it speeds up the transition to net zero. You can do more quickly by encouraging people to change their travel choices. It makes the transition a fairer and more equitable one. It's not just about being able to afford to transition to an electric vehicle, for example. And thirdly, I think it de-risks the transition and doesn't make it all about the technological change from petrol and diesel engines to zero-emission engines. What WPI also illuminated for us was the fact that the change was desirable, not just because of its contribution to reducing carbon emissions, but because it also brought wider socio-economic and health benefits, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. And thirdly, and perhaps most contentiously, they concluded it was possible. Because if you speak to the public about their attitudes to travel choices and their impact on the environment, at a high level, people will tend to agree with statements like, I ought to use my car a little less. We ought to be charged to drive into city centres at busy times, for example. Now, translating that into action has proved very difficult for policymakers around the world. But at a high level, the change goes with the grain of public opinion, and I think that's important. What level of change are we talking about in order to stay on the CCC's balanced pathway? So what WPI did was to, where the CCC had said a certain proportion of journeys would need to shift to public transport, WPI said, well, 30% of public transport mileage at the moment is currently by bus. So as a simplifying assumption, let's assume that 30% of the change goes to bus as well. They then looked at research into the potential to grow bus use in different parts of the UK. And the potential to grow bus use is really a factor of two things. One, what are the demographics of an area? So broadly speaking, the more densely populated an area, the more you can expect high levels of bus use. And secondly, what's the current level of bus use? So an area which is underperforming relative to others has more potential to grow. One of the things they found through that was that Wales as a nation had more room to grow than other parts of the United Kingdom, because per capita bus use is lower than elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And the average across Great Britain increase of 25% per decade, which they said would be needed, was actually bigger than that in Wales. And you can see on the bottom left there, they said that in order to stay on that balanced pathway, we would need to see a 66% increase over the remainder of this decade in bus use, and we'd need to see bus use more than doubled by 2050. And all of those changes are big. They are massive changes in the level of demand for bus, and they come against a history of decades of decline. So bus travel has been declining by at least 10% for the last 70 years, literally since records began. And it looked at through that end of the telescope, it's a very, very big change indeed. But looked at through the other end of the telescope, actually it starts to feel a bit more manageable, because the scale of change we're talking about is equivalent to 1 journey per driver per month by 2030, 2 journeys per driver per month by 2050. As we got on to the second report from WPI, which looked at how you might start to achieve that scale of change, they began by looking at what's the current policy landscape and what can we expect to see from what's currently going on in each of the nations. And this was quite a tricky thing to do, because none of the nations have long-term or even medium-term plans to invest in bus services. So what our researchers did was look at the level of funding for bus that was embedded in the 21-22 budget and say, let's assume that that level of investment, which I think was about £20 million in that year in things like bus infrastructure, let's assume that continues each year over the period until 2050. £540 million of total investment in today's prices. That will generate some modal shift, but as you can see from the graphic on the bottom of the screen, only about 1/5 of the required modal shift. So that scale of investment would increase, other things being equal, bus travel by about 30%, whereas bus travel over the period as a whole needs to increase by 150% in broad terms. They then went on to look at, okay, so what are the additional policy levers which might fill the gap and generate the scale of change which in their first report they identified was necessary. So they started by looking at, if you like, the logical extremes in terms of making motoring more expensive and making bus travel free. So the ends of the spectrum, if you like. So you could do it through making motoring more expensive. Their research suggests that in order to generate the scale of change needed, you would have to increase the real cost of motoring by about 4.5% per year in real terms each year from now until 2050, which obviously is politically somewhere on the scale from difficult to impossible, I'm sure. The other end of the spectrum, making buses free would be very, very expensive and would actually have limited impact. Most of the benefit of the policy would go to people who already use buses, and that may well be something that government decides is a good thing to do for its own purposes, but as a contribution to the modal shift required, it's actually pretty poor value for money. So expenditure of about £150 million per year which would generate around 11% of the total modal shift which is required. So no surprise, really. They concluded that modal shift was very, very unlikely to be about single policies, and you actually need a package of complementary measures. So what we did with WPI and with the Social Market Foundation over the course of last summer was run a series of 7, I think, roundtables across the country to identify what might go in that package of measures. There's a very, very long list of possible policies in the annex to our report. But broadly speaking, they fall into 3 categories. One, you can make the bus network more attractive. You can make it bigger, more frequent, better services, better quality of buses. Secondly, you can make buses cheaper. And against those 2 carrots, you've got the stick, option number 3, of discouraging the use of cars by making car travel relatively less attractive. Underpinning all of those, although it is very, very hard to research because there are very few examples of it actually taking place, you've got a range of behavioural interventions or nudges which might influence consumer choices on top of those 3 measures. So WPI very consciously didn't try to design a particular solution. They didn't try to come up with all of the answers in the time available. But what they did model for us were some examples of the sort of scale of intervention in each area which might be necessary. So under the sorry, this font's so small I'm struggling to see it from here. Under the category of increasing the attractiveness of the bus network, they looked at what's been going on in England in recent years, where all local authorities have been invited to bid for funds to improve their bus network, and said, let's take that as a marker of what's needed, and let's take that per capita amount and assume that that amount is spent in Wales in this case as well. And they called that an ambitious investment in the bus network, totalling about 1.8 billion over the period in question. They then looked at 2 options for making buses cheaper. One they called bus bonus, and that's effectively a scheme by which regular commuters get tax breaks on their bus season tickets, up to a value of £800 a year. They also looked at a long-term version of the £2 fare cap, which is currently in place for a 3-month period in England. In terms of discouraging the use of the car, they focused on congestion charge, and they looked at 2 variants, both of which would charge £7 per day for driving in urban areas. In Wales, that means Newport, Cardiff, Swansea, Wrexham. One of them only charges people entering the city centre. One of them charges people for entering the whole of the urban area, so the low scenario and the high scenario. And if you put all of those policies together, or a combination of those types of policies together, they felt that you could make a real dent in the required modal shift in Wales. Roughly 80% of the modal shift required could be achieved. And with some of the things that they found difficult to model, because they were doing national level economic modelling, you might be able to do even better. So changes to the planning system which were outside of their scope, behaviour change campaigns and marketing, the sort of localised tailoring and adaptation that you can't really do at a national level, could make it more effective. And what's really happening, as you can see in the graphic at the bottom, hopefully, is that most of the work is being done by the ambitious investment in the bus network. So making buses more frequent, making them quicker and making them more reliable does lots of the heavy lifting in terms of encouraging people to make the shift. What the congestion charge would do would be to, generate a hefty shove in that direction as well, but it would also raise a huge amount of revenue and would make the policy revenue generative in the round. Or put another way, it opens up huge potential to design a congestion charging scheme in a way which is seen to be fair to all groups. So you don't have to have a blanket £7 for everybody entering the area. You can give exemptions for example, disabled people who are dependent on their cars for their travel. So it gives you lots of options because you're generating quite a bit of money potentially from that congestion charge. And there'd also be much wider benefits, as I alluded to earlier on. So there are the reduction in carbon emissions which are necessary to stay on the balanced pathway. That's the first thing. There are also co-benefits in terms of improved air quality. So less people travelling in private cars means less emissions of nitrous oxides and particulate matter. There are also huge socio-economic benefits, worth, they estimate, about £2.2 billion. That comes from both a reduction in congestion and health benefits through a reduction in accidents and an improvement in people's likeliness to walk, simply because if you're getting the bus, you're at least walking to the bus stop each day. And because the ambitious investment in bus package that they modelled had quite a large growth in the bus network across Wales, you also get very positive impacts on local labour markets. You've got more people able to access more job and training opportunities, which could result in 1,400 extra people in employment over the period in question. They concluded that there are a number of principles that are required to sit behind the sort of policies that they described, or indeed any policies in this space. One, your modal shift can't be piecemeal. There needs to be a strategy and it needs to be joined up. It needs to be fully integrated with broader measures to reduce the use of private cars. So it's no point, for example, trying to attract more people on bus while subsidising parking in city centres, to take one example. You need to have a firm financial footing and certainty of funding for, in this case, the bus sector to enable you to play your part in modal shift policy. The opportunities aren't the same everywhere. Transport demand is very segmented by location and by purpose. You're likely to get the biggest benefits in urban areas as opposed to rural areas. So there may be other reasons for investing in bus services in rural areas. And you really require a holistic package of interventions to make it work and to make buses the most convenient transport options. And for my final slide, I just wanted to highlight one place in England which is currently trying to apply these principles in practice, and that's Cambridge. They spoke at the launch of our UK report last year and talked about the work that they are currently consulting on, which will have 3 phases to it. One, they will start by transforming the bus network. So they'll use both of the 2 carrots that I talked about earlier. They'll make the bus network more attractive with more services going more often to more places. And secondly, they'll make it cheaper with a flat fare of £2 for adults, £1 for children. At the same time, they'll be investing in walking and cycling and more promotion of active travel. And they're going to fund all of that through a congestion charging zone, or a sustainable travel zone, as they call it. And all of the revenue from that will be ring-fenced to spend on those transport improvements. Critically, in addition to what I've already said, they're doing the bus network transformation first and the active travel improvements. And that, they feel, enables them to say, when they come to charge people to drive into Cambridge, you've got options, you've got alternatives, we've already invested in them. And that in turn was dependent on a particular stream of funding which the Peterborough and Cambridge Combined Authority got from government, which enabled them to make that upfront investment. That's all I wanted to say in terms of slides. Thank you very much for your time in listening. Look forward to questions and discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. There we are. I think we're calling up our colleagues who are joining us virtually now on the screen. There we are. Nice to see you again. OK, excellent. I was going to ask a few general questions about the background to the report, but obviously you've covered much of that in your presentation. So, Delith, do you want to pick up on anything to kick us off?
Diolch, Cadeirydd. Thank you so much for that presentation. Now, this work does follow on from the earlier work from July last year, the decarbonisation dividend, that work. Could you outline in a bit more detail, please, how this work kind of builds on that or follows on from that?
Yes, so the decarbonisation dividend was really about what's needed. And it tried to settle for each nation and region of the United Kingdom what might be the required scale of modal shift over the next 30 or so years in order to stay on that balanced pathway. What the second report did was say, OK, we'll take that as our target. Let's identify the package of measures that could deliver it. And that second report was really based on those round tables which took place last summer and which brought together a variety of stakeholders from government, from the industry, from wider civil society, and said, this is what we are trying to achieve. This is what expert advice tells us is necessary to deliver net zero. How are we going to do it? So the second report, if you like, was a logical extension of the first report.
Thank you for that.
Great. Jenny?
I think one of the issues that I wanted to explore was you said it would take a 4.5% per year in real terms increase in the cost of running a car.
Yep.
Hasn't there been that already this year? Because the price of insurance has gone up massively and the price of petrol too. It is possible.
So I haven't done the sums, but you're absolutely right that the price of motoring over the last 18 months has rocketed because of fuel and insurance. And it has had some limited impact on people's travel choices, I think. There are parts of the country where we're seeing an uplift in bus travel, for example, as a result. I think there's a difference, though, between that happening as a result of global events, and you can talk about it being a result of the war in Ukraine, as opposed to it happening as the result of the application of deliberate government policy. And we've seen in the United Kingdom the difficulty, or the impossibility of sticking to the fuel duty escalator, which is supposed to escalate the rate of fuel duty above the rate of inflation each year, but which in practice doesn't do so.
Well, it's not impossible. It's just there's a lack of political will. But I suppose I just want to look at the behavioural nudges that could be done to accompany some bold political decision-making, which is absent at the moment. To some extent, although, as you know, the Welsh Government has done this roads review, which we're going to see the result of next week, but I think the Deputy Minister for Climate Change is on the case. However, we don't know what that is going to say. The behavioural nudges surely need to be focused on two key journeys. One is the travel to school. Extraordinary number of people who take their kids to school by car, even in secondary school in Wales, and it just blows my mind. And the other is obviously ensuring that all employers have proper travel to work policies that support their employees to get from A to B. Because those are the two most wasteful use of the car. We're never going to get people to stop using their car to take granny out for the day. It's just, that's not going to happen. So those two key daily or 5 times a week journeys are surely where we should be focusing. And some schools have shown that it is perfectly possible, but they are few and far between.
Yes, I think those are excellent ideas, and working with those flows of multiple people is much easier than working with individual people. There are some good examples, as you say, in the education sector, which tend to promote walking and cycling, and that's absolutely fine. You know, I'm here to speak for bus and coach, but, you know, active travel's great as well. There are some signs of workplaces getting involved as well. The NHS, for example, as part of its net zero policy, is starting to engage with the industry in terms of joined up travel plans, which are part of that. There's clearly much more to be done. And more generally, I think there are some consistent messages which need to be got across as part of the behavioural campaign. I think we need to be showing people that the level of change is actually really manageable, because climate change and my personal contribution to it can feel really, really intangible. I think telling people that making a small change makes a difference and is a good start is really important. Secondly, I think we need to normalise the change, and that's why workplaces and schools are really important, because you can say, well, everybody else is doing it, and I'm part of a collective that's doing it. And thirdly, I think you need to be very, very clear about what you're trying to achieve as a government, whether as a central government or as a local authority. You need to be clear about the benefits of attracting people to travel in different ways. And I think applying those things, as you say, through schools, through the workplace, it could be a really important contribution alongside some of the more economic policies that I've described today.
I've got hands going up everywhere now. So I've got I've got Joyce coming in next, then Delith, then Hugh, and then we'll come on to Janet.
I just wonder, in terms of not just modal change, but behaviour change, the fact that people work from home now more than they ever did, whether any of that was factored in as the cost-benefit of, you know, perhaps investing lots of money in transport that people aren't going to use because they're not actually going to work, maybe one day a week. So that was a key question for me. You've already accepted the socio-economic benefits will advantage the urban rather than the rural, and I cover all the rural area in Wales. So I suppose what I'm talking about here is equalising the cost benefit to the maximum. So if you could address those two things.
So to take the rural-urban point, first of all, if your objective is to maximise the contribution to progress towards reducing emissions, then you would focus resources on urban areas, because that's where you've got most people making journeys where they have options and could have more options in future. That is not at all to say that we think that government should neglect the promotion of bus in rural areas. We don't. It's simply to say that it makes a contribution to different policy objectives, and it makes less of a contribution to the specific policy objective of reducing carbon emissions. And sorry, would you remind me of your first question as well?
Working from home. Working
from home is a really important trend, which for some people, obviously not all people, is here to stay. We feel the impact of that in the bus sector, where we're seeing much more travel on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays through regular commuting than we are on Mondays and Fridays. I don't believe that the CCC factored much of that into their report, because the report that I'm talking about was done during the pandemic rather than after we'd taken time to account for it. But I believe that in setting modal shift targets within Wales, there is an assumption that some car journeys can be removed altogether because people will work from home in future, which I think is a sensible way of tackling it, because I think for people who've got the choice of working from home, which isn't all of us obviously, I think that pattern is now set and people will continue to do that for the long term.
Because I think there's a target of 30%, isn't there, in Wales, of people working from home stated by the government. So obviously that will have a knock-on effect then on maybe some of the economics of some of these things as well. Delith.
Diolch. I'm really fascinated by the point that you were making in response to Jenny about normalising the use of bus travel. Are there other parts of the UK, like London in particular, or other cities, in other countries, particularly if we look at not just one metropolis, but other places in the world where you think somehow that same societal norm is different, and that people, it isn't seen as this thing like, oh no, you know, what was the Thatcher thing about, like, if you use the bus, if a man is using the bus when he's in his 30s, then he has failed or something, you know, where that just hasn't really, where it's completely different, and where we could learn from in terms of changing societal norms?
Yeah, no, that is a great question, Dallas. I was talking about something slightly different, which is when you're promoting the need for change, make sure that you emphasise that, you know, you're joining the collective. You're not doing this by yourself. But you're absolutely right, and it's one of the things that came out in our round tables, that we could benefit from some more cities and towns and places which looked like places where you use the bus. And it's quite hard to capture, but when you're in London, I'm from London originally, when you're in London and you're in the centre of London, it looks like a place where you get the bus, because there are so many buses on the street and relatively few private cars. In fact, it's almost all buses and white vans these days. And you don't see that elsewhere, I don't think, to the same extent. And it's about the design of our towns and cities and the spaces in which we allow different vehicles. So, you know, I was in Cardiff yesterday evening on St Mary Street, and there are lots of buses there, but there's also lots and lots of taxis and private cars and hubbub. And I'm not trying to redesign Cardiff city centre at the moment, but I'm just sort of observing that it's not an obvious place to get the bus in the same way that London, perhaps parts of central Edinburgh are. And I think there's a real challenge for us in going beyond bus policy to think, how do we redesign our urban spheres to make them look more like, of course I'm going to get the bus, it's the obvious thing to do.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's the whole inquiry, I think, for us as a committee. Particularly. The whole placemaking thing is really important too.
Sadly, on the way in on the train today, I actually read the Infrastructure Commissioner's blog on the Roads Review coming out, and his suggestions, some which ties into this, and he described some contexts such as motor normality, which was a new one to me, but I now understand it from what you're saying as well as what he described, the idea that we've made some pretty bad choices down the years about the way that we've invested. And I say this as a two-car owner in our family as well, but somebody who travels by train and occasionally gets on the bus as well. We've made choices that have led us to this point in time, and unwinding that is a significant challenge. I want to ask you two questions. One is a very practical one, and one is this issue of behaviour. You're right that in London, the question for most people, and I lived there for 15 years working, is why would I own a car? Because it's so easy, frankly, to get on a bus, a train, overland railway, link them up, integrate a ticket in, affordable ticket in, yeah, that makes sense for most people. And you know that there's another transport option around the corner. So the question is, and the practical one is, how we get to a point, Cardiff is the obvious one here, Cardiff and Newport conurbation, do we get to the point that we have exactly what you described, where we have priority to buses and coaches to access the city centre, where we have elements of congestion charging, or we can see what's happening in London now with the extension of the ultra-low emission zones, which is another nudge factor for people who are thinking of taking their diesels into London and so on. How do we get to that point where we have that? But then, how does that benefit Bridgend? So Bridgend and Ogmore, so that somebody like me can choose not to just go on the train or drive in and risk the traffic jams, but I can get to Bridgend, and there is a fast stream one that zips straight down the motorway, goes into the city centre on a dedicated lane, that squeezes motorists in the private cars off there and gets me in. That's the reality of where we need to be heading, I think you'd agree. So what's the impediments that stop us getting there? My suggestion would be this cannot be done by Cardiff City Council on its own. This is a regional approach that will then give the exemplar that you're talking about, showing this is how it's done. And it's not just a benefit to Cardiff, it's a benefit to people commuting from the region into Cardiff.
Yeah, no, I think that is a a great set of questions, a great set of provocations. I'd love to be able to give you a complete answer to it. If I knew what it was, I'd be, advocating it widely across the United Kingdom. But you're absolutely right to think about what can we learn from London, and there's different lessons you can take from the London experience. I think I'd take a couple really. One is London's got a unique geography. It's so dense compared to anywhere else in the United Kingdom that it's much easier to put on intensive public transport services, and that's why it's so much easier to use them. Secondly, you need to think about the extent to which you fund and subsidise public transport. So,
Yes.
so the bus network in London is hugely subsidised to the tune of about £2 million a day, I think.
Indeed, some of that comes from congestion charging.
Yes.
So would you agree on your point earlier on congestion charging, the revenues that go from that should not, on my concept, if we were ever to get to this point, simply go to Cardiff electrical vehicles. It should go to Cardiff and region modal shift, which could be electrical vehicles, but it should also be ones that extend out across Newport, out down towards the west as well.
Mm-hmm.
So congestion charging makes the scenario you describe easier because you start to build those affordable alternatives that have a wide reach.
So I think that there are benefits in having a national approach to things like congestion charging.
Right.
So that you are not just thinking about it as a series of different islands that have their own slightly different congestion charging policies, which are all about Wrexham or Cardiff or Swansea, as the case may be, but that you have a national approach which focuses on those areas because that's where the opportunity is in this space, but also potentially opens up the benefits to broader areas, so that you are taking the benefits that accrue in Cardiff and spreading them a little bit more widely across South Wales, to take your example. So I would agree that is a sensible way forward.
Could I ask one other short supplementary? This is a different one. There's a practical one there about how you pull some of these interventions together. I'm just interested in your thoughts on where we've got to with the perception of buses outside of places like London, or some of the good work in Liverpool and area and Manchester as well. But that perception, it's contested whether Margaret Thatcher ever said that statement.
I know, yeah.
And so on. So I'm going to avoid that for a moment. But another famous politician of a different party once famously said, and I'll paraphrase, if you provide a welfare state for poor people, you'll end up with a poor welfare state. If you provide buses and coaches and public transport for poor people, you will end up with a poor public transport system. This has got to be something that is not just easy to use and affordable and so on, but is attractive universally to everybody. And that means lovely buses, regular buses, affordable buses with Wi-Fi on, that are comfortable, that you enjoy going on, etc. That's the reality of the shift that we are looking at, that to challenge that perception, that this is not, because we often talk about it in the chamber, that the number of people who rely on buses because they have no other alternative. Yet what we've got to do is saying, yeah, but that's not what we're providing for. We're providing for them, also providing them for Llŷr and Hugh and Jenny and Joyce and Janet and everybody and Della.
I couldn't agree more. And we should never forget the role that bus and coach has to play in supporting the transport of people who've got no other options.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
is a really vital part of what we do.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right to say we strengthen the sector by making it more universal and encouraging more people to use buses, use coaches. And what I would say is the evidence shows that where people use the bus, they actually like it, and there's a long body of transport-focused research that shows that people who use the bus are generally very, very satisfied with their last journey. They're satisfied with the facilities, the cleanliness, the attitude of the driver. They can have grumbles about reliability and punctuality because we tend to get stuck behind cars and other vehicles, but they're generally very happy about it. So the key is to get more people trying it for the first time. I find when people do try the bus for the first time, there was a very good pilot scheme in Birmingham a couple of years ago, Bus Pioneers, I think it was called, that people realised that buses aren't like they were last time they used them 20 years ago. You can, in general, charge your phone, get Wi-Fi, pay by contactless. It's not dirty. There's not loads of school kids at the back throwing stuff at you, whatever your negative perception is. So I think you really need some measures which encourage people to try bus at least once. And it might be something investing in a really high quality park and ride system, so that you capture people on those difficult journeys into city centres and get them on a mode of transport that they wouldn't otherwise try.
Okay, I'm conscious that Janet is being very patient with us. I know we've got a couple of things you want to raise, but Joyce just wants to come in on one more thing, and then we'll certainly move on.
Just two very quick ones. Congestion charging is going to reduce if you reduce the number of vehicles. So I'm wondering what work you've done in terms of the revenue that's been brought in by congestion charges. In the early days, of course it would have been cheaper, so you've got to put those figures in terms of what they would be now and what you're getting now, because the logic tells you there has to be less money if there's less cars. So it's not an absolute, reliable, infinite source of money. And the other big elephant in the room, of course, is the deregulation of buses. So those are the two key questions, because they are key questions if we're going to move forward.
Yes, so what the WPI research did was look at the experience of London in terms of applying a congestion charge. Obviously, it must have been 20 or so years ago now, and the experience ever since. So in terms of projecting forward the revenue and the revenue base for that, they've taken into account the fact that having a congestion charge will deter some people from making journeys. So over time, you have a lower base to charge, if that makes sense. In terms of the regulatory system, could I just clarify what your question is?
Deregulation of buses simply means at the moment that those companies who are best placed cream off the profitable and leave big, huge gaps, particularly in Wales, of the non-profit making bus routes for us to fill the gap.
Okay.
And just to add to that, the work that we did in our previous report highlighted that the least well-off areas actually lost the most services during COVID. So clearly there's a question about companies cherry-picking the more sustainable routes, etc., and how do we sort of mitigate against that?
Thank you for that clarification. There have been lots of routes lost as a result of changes since the pandemic. It's really unfortunate, but faced with a combination of declining passenger numbers and spiralling costs, operators have had to make tough decisions. And often those decisions have been felt most acutely, I think, in rural areas, in places where communities are more disadvantaged, because they've been least likely to return to travelling. And there's been a particular impact in terms of concessionary travel, which flows through into the funding which operators have received. Operators are doing all they can to maintain services everywhere they can, with the support of the BES scheme, obviously, provided by Welsh Government. But they can't keep all services running indefinitely. Adjustments have to be made.
Okay, thank you. Right, we'll come to Janet and then we'll come back to Jenny then. Janet.
Thank you. Just going back to the modal shift, do you actually think the Welsh Government targets are ambitious enough? And how do they compare to those considered in the report?
So yes, I was looking at these, and they're in a slightly different currency, aren't they? So if I understand it, the Welsh Government's targets are to get the share of journeys which are by public transport, walking or cycling, from 32% to 45% by 2040, which is a different currency to what we're talking about, which, you know, we're talking about the change solely in terms of bus travel. I think they are broadly consistent, but, you know, they're not the same because they're not measuring quite the same thing. and therefore I do think that they are in the right space in terms of ambition.
Okay. Now, obviously, in the Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru cooperation agreement, they make a clear promise to ask Transport for Wales to work with local authorities in North West Wales and the Welsh Government to develop plans for an integrated transport. Now, as we've been discussing this, in fact, when we last talked about this in the Senedd, since then, one of my main routes, the T19, from Blaen and Festiniog, that actually then goes through to Llandrillo, so it affects the secondary school chair, as you'll be aware, Ysgol Dyffryn Conwy and Llandrillo. And honestly, at the moment, it has been mind-boggling trying to get any local authority to speak to each other, to speak to the bus companies. I've never known anything in the time I've been in politics as bad. So in one way, we're doing lots of this about getting all this, and yet we're actually now in a situation where children are not going to be able to go to school in my constituency if they live outside, nor are students able to go to the Llandrillo College. So we seem to still be going backwards, yet we're talking things up about more positively going forwards and getting more people using buses and things. What am I missing here?
No, I don't think you're missing anything. I think that's a great observation. I can't obviously speak specifically about the T19 service in your area, but it's a pattern that I see across the country, across Wales, across England, across Scotland as well. We are going backwards in terms of bus service provision as a result of changes which have taken place because of the pandemic, where we all agree that we need to go forwards. So it's really important, I think, at this moment in time that we work collectively as operators, with local authorities and with central government to manage those changes. And I think in the specific context we're facing in Wales, it's really important that Welsh Government continues to provide funding to the industry to put on more services through the BES scheme, and that is extended into next financial year and beyond, or else we're going to have a harder landing than is necessary, and it's going to be much, much harder to make that bounce back to the future that we're all trying to achieve.
And of course, I mean, we are expecting a bus bill here in Wales, which presumably will come before this committee for scrutiny, and the whole franchising, proposal will become clearer in terms of what exactly that means for those kinds of services. So, I mean, what kind of engagement are you having with government around sort of work to prepare for that bill?
So, our team in Wales have been working very closely with Welsh Government around the potential buses bill. At the moment, we are working with independent researchers to produce an independent impact assessment so that we can give Welsh Government a evidence-based view of how franchising may change the network in future and some of the impacts and some of the things that government ought to be clear of. What we'll be expressing in all of that engagement is changing the regulatory system by itself will not change the fundamental issues we're dealing with. It will not bring more money into the industry to support the provision of essential services like the ones that you were talking about, Joyce, for example. It won't make buses the natural choice and challenge. Was it motor normality that you were talking about? It won't invest in more services. It might be an enabler for some of those things if it's done well, but it won't by itself transform the landscape and turn the industry around. So it's.
But you would see it as an important part of the jigsaw.
I mean, the Welsh Government have been very clear about their desire to introduce a franchise system. We are working with them to help them understand the risks and potential benefits of it, and it's clearly a very, very important part of the landscape going forward.
And clearly, I think you'd obviously have a part to play in our scrutiny of the bill when the time comes. Jenny, and then Hugh.
But right now, we're absolutely between a rock and a hard place, because the bus emergency scheme has been very useful in helping us to build up passenger numbers. Yep. I can only talk about Cardiff because I represent a Cardiff seat. We're now back to 75 to 80% of the passenger numbers we had pre-COVID. because the bus emergency scheme is being cut by the UK government, what are we now going to do if we don't have a bus emergency scheme out of resources that the Welsh Government may have great difficulty finding, given all the other things going on, where the Cardiff Bus is saying they're going to have to cut the bus service by a third if they don't have a further equivalent to the bus emergency scheme, and also would have a major impact on school transport as well. So, and yet we don't have the secondary legislation in place, or indeed the national approach to congestion charging. You know, we're just not sufficiently geared up to make that modal shift. What can we do next year?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. To get to the long term, we've got to survive the short term. And the problems that you describe are real and genuine. We are, as an organisation, we're managing them in Wales, but also in England and Scotland, where exactly the same risks appear. Funding schemes in all three nations are set to expire at the end of March. And if they are not replaced, there will be reductions of anywhere between 10 and 30%. It varies on the part of the country you're in. And that scale of reduction is a function of two things, really. Passenger numbers are not where they were. They are 15 to 20% down. Again, varies from area to area. Costs have gone up by around about 25% since the start of the pandemic, mainly fueled by paying our staff more. We're a people-heavy business, and there's been some quite hefty pay settlements over the last year. And fares haven't gone up very much at all. So we've opened up this big gap between our revenues and our costs, which has been filled very successfully, I think, by BES and by other schemes. If those schemes are pulled away without any sort of soft landing, any sort of continuation of the scheme and tapering away, there will, I'm afraid, be some stark reductions in services of the nature that you've heard Cardiff Bus talking about, Jenny.
Yes, okay, thank you, Hugh.
I get your points on the funding. We need to get through this in order to get to the bigger picture we're talking about, but it's a real issue at the moment. But I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier on, that in Cambridge, they're looking at, and I declare my interest as chair of the cross-body group on active travel, but I'm also a member of the public transport CPG here as well, as many members are, that they're focusing first of all on public transport in order to give that readily accessible alternative option to people rather than active travel, possibly on the basis that most people are more likely to use a good public transport option than necessarily travel that 2 or 3 miles by walking or cycling. I get that. Is that a sensible approach? Does anything in your research bear that out, that first of all you should invest in the public transport? Not that you shouldn't invest in active travel, but public transport first, followed by active travel, or?
I do apologise. I think I may have misspoke.
Right.
They're investing in transport improvements before they introduce the sustainable travel zone.
Right.
And I may have said public transport, but it's also active travel as well.
Okay.
So they are making the options better before they charge people to drive.
Yes.
All
the options.
Yes.
Good.
And that does seem to me a very, very sensible way of doing it.
Yeah.
I think it's also very, very sensible that you do the public transport and active travel improvements hand in hand.
Right.
Otherwise, you risk ending up with a situation where somebody's built a cycle lane and then a year later they go along and they try and fit a bus lane alongside it and it inconveniences the cyclists or vice versa.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, good. Joyce, anything?
Socio-economic benefits, we've touched on them, but I want to touch on them in terms of active travel as well. I mean, I live in a town there. Most people couldn't cycle up the hill if they tried. You have to be extremely fit because that's the way Wales is. And owning a bike, you know, and I know there are schemes, and this is what I want to come to, where you can rent a bike for the journey that you want. So in terms of looking at the affordability, socio-economic ability to take that modal shift, which doesn't include buses, it doesn't include walking because it might be stretched too far. Those schemes that you've looked at, have they included that? And I know in Cardiff, you know, you can rent a bike, but bikes are expensive things now and out of the reach of most people.
Yeah, we didn't look at that in our research. We only asked our researchers to look at the impact of improvements to the bus and coach network. What you say is very, very sensible, and quite understand the difficulties that some people might have in affording a bike, and renting a bike or an e-scooter or whatever the form of mobility might be seems like a sensible complement to some of the things that we're talking about, but we didn't study it in detail, unfortunately.
Okay. Of course, the other socio-economic barrier, we've touched on lots of them, is the affordability, and you've touched on it, of actually getting on a bus. But have you broken down in your research who's most affected by that? You know, those people who are still using buses, of course, rather than those who are choosing not to. Because we do have schemes where people benefit and others don't.
We didn't look in detail at the segmentation of current users and who would benefit most from reductions to fares. So what WPI were trying to do for us was paint a broad picture of what might happen if you put, for example, £100 million into fare subsidies. They didn't go into detail of how you might apply that because they felt that is a question for national and local governments to decide, you know, who do we want to benefit most? Do we want to target these reductions at apprentices and job seekers? Do we want to target them at young people? Do we want to target them in people who live in places where there are less alternative transport options? But our specific piece of research didn't look at that in detail.
Okay, Hugh, then, just to conclude, well, and Janet, very briefly, just to conclude.
I'm conscious of that the focus on this is very much to do with moving towards net zero, but all of these things tie together in how we get there in terms of bus transport. Let me just ask you two realistic questions. In a place like Ogmore, Valleys community, linear valleys, whatever, should someone like me be able to do my job by bus? In other words, to get to surgeries, get to meetings by bus, up and down valleys, is one question. Second question is, should people who live on the same hill that I do, in my state park, at the top of a hill, not currently on one of the standard scheduled bus routes, should they be able to access a bus in future, close to, in walking distance from their home? Or do we now accept that there are going to be some communities that are remote from scheduled bus services?
I think those are great questions. We would love you and everybody else to be able to do their job travelling by bus or by coach. That isn't feasible given the current funding environment and the current economics of the industry.
Yeah, that's fair enough to say that.
But we would like it to become feasible. One of the things that we are looking at is whether it's possible to define and then implement some sort of minimum service guarantee. You'll have seen the Commission on the Future of the UK talk about it. Might be a good idea to have a minimum infrastructure guarantee so communities know what they expect. I think that's a really interesting idea. And measuring the gap between what can currently be delivered and what might be desirable for somebody who lives at the head of a valley, for example, is a really good topic to get to grips with.
Because these are the behaviour choices that help us deliver net zero. Because if I can give up one of my cars, because I know that I can not only do my work in Cardiff, but I can do it around my constituency by public transport, that's a choice that I will then make. But it's also the choice for that elderly family, that elderly couple living on top of the hill, who want to access the shops, meet their neighbours, because instead of getting in a taxi, they can get on something that is more zero carbon friendly.
Yeah, and I think that's a great illustration. And of course, the answer might not always be a bus as we currently know it. It might be what people call demand responsive transport, such as the flexi system that's been trialled in Newport.
And there are members who've actually travelled on buses to engage with their constituents
Indeed.
as well, and use the opportunity to have those chats
Brilliant.
and discussions.
Absolutely.
Very, very briefly, Jenny, because we are out of time.
And you said that Cambridge is not introducing any of the sticks until they've got all the carrots in place.
Correct.
But how do we, I mean, how can we afford to wait for that, given that we face the crunch that you mentioned, but you didn't provide with any solution? So I'm pressing you. What do we do now? Because it takes quite a long time to get all the lovely public transport options and the cycle routes, etc., in place. And meantime, we have an absolute crisis.
So I presented Cambridge as an example where the consultation and the research they've done with local residents and local businesses told them very, very clearly indeed that you need to improve the public transport and active travel options before you start charging for car usage, and therefore that's what they're doing. I think I would say that all of the research evidence shows that that's the right way to do it. But you're quite right to say that at times when the need is urgent, you might want to do it in a different way. And I think it's a question for Welsh Government whether they want to take a different approach and start to introduce measures which make travelling by car a little bit less attractive for some journeys. Because the only other option is to put more funding into the public transport network now as a matter of urgency so that we can start to make improvements quickly. So there are choices available. Cambridge is just an example of how they've chosen to tackle it given their particular context.
Thank you.
There are choices available indeed, and your work certainly helps enrich our considerations and deliberations around some of those. So thank you, Graham, for joining us. It's been really useful. And as I said earlier on, much of what you've shared with us chimes with some of the work that we've done and will certainly add great value to our ongoing work on not only the bus bill, but the wider modal shift issues and decarbonisation of transport as well, which are areas that we will cover for the remainder of this Senedd as a committee and revisit regularly. So, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much for your attendance.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
OK, our next item then is to note a few papers that we have before us. There are 3 papers in total. Are we happy to